running now.
So Cornelius suggested we share a little bit about the science of cold plasma as the work of Dr. Cachet and others. And we're going to try to get to some of the kind of pure principle, geometric essence of how these rotating plasma fields, monoatomics work, and why they're so powerful, both for energy, propulsion, and life force. We're trying to really understand the principle here. So first thing we want to talk about is the significance of monoatomic materials in general. Dr. Cachet demonstrated amazing intuition in getting the exact alkaline environment and the exact temperature to get the monoatoms to migrate and be stable as a monoatom on the surface of the metal, copper for example. And we're in process of doing nuclear analysis of the monoatomic gas materials with our wonderful partner there, Jean-Paul Biverian, who leads the cold fusion work in Europe, who met Dr. Cachet with us. In the meantime, we've come to understand something about the sort of electrical understanding of why these plasmas are so powerful. We really respect the fact that Dr. Cachet has an amazing background in nuclear science, but the electrical engineering language for this adds a whole new dimension of understanding of the pure principle, we think. And so let's have this conversation and see if it's fun. So years ago, I was privileged to be working with Buckminster Fuller. And Buckminster Fuller showed me many things, the vector flexor, non-destructive collapse. We don't have all our toys here, but one of the things he showed me, of course, was the geodesic dome structures, which later, when the carbon scientists discovered the geometry that monoatom carbon took and carbon lattice structure took when it was charged, and if you pass a little bit of lightning, a little flame or an arc past the soot, for example, from a candle, the carbon would form a structure that looked like and when the scientists first saw the structure that these monoatom carbon lattice structures took, and later carbon nanotubes took, this was after Bucky Fuller's death. But they so much were reminded of Bucky Fuller when they looked at him, the chemists called it Buckminster Fullerene.
And it's a basic carbon structure.
The carbon takes this structure, this Icosa, dodeca-Icosa lattice structure, is a natural structure for carbon. Where you say, wait, no, I thought carbon was a diamond lattice, which is octa. But it's true that in the presence of a spark, in the presence of a spark, the carbon will unpack from the natural tetracubic lattice, the 7-arrow lattice, which in here in the center is green. The carbon actually unpacks to a lattice where, remember, here's a carbon bond. The carbon bond normally in diamond is a octahedral lattice, the natural lattice structure for diamond. But now, in the presence of charge, in this case a spark, which is also how Tesla developed the carbon arc lamp into reversible cold fusion, which is what drove Tesla's famous car. And it's the same thing. He was passing a spark next to the carbon arc. And the carbon bond would go from this, which you can visualize, is the top of a tetra or octa.
Yeah.
And in the presence of charge, the carbon bond would unpack slightly. And if you look in an Icosa dodeca, here's a dodeca.
Yeah.
If you look at the edge of a dodeca here, that's a triangle bond right there. It's very simple.
Yeah.
But it's taken the bond that was the octacube, which is the diamond lattice of carbon, and it's unpacked it slightly. Right. And when it does that, carbon forms a new lattice called Buckminster Fullerene, which is dodeca-Icosa, which we now know is a 3D fractal, which was so exciting that Buckminster Fullerene for many years was the hottest subject in every chemistry class on planet Earth. And it was the most often published subject in every chemistry journal on planet Earth for many years. Why? Buckminster Fullerene monoatomic carbon creates an unusual quality of electrical space in the center. If you pack something in that magic space in the center, which we now know is fractal implosive, and I call it phase conjugate, it's literally the 0-point energy spot. Now it turns out that Buckminster Fullerene, and if you look at carbon nanotubes and all their unusual superconductive electrical properties, and if you look at the same dodecahelix of DNA or gold, when it's a monofilament, the helix of gold is famous for being a superconductor. Actually, specifically DNA or gold thread will form a superconductor if zapped with lightning at the moment of crystallization, exactly like Daniel Brinkley's DNA became a superconductor when he had his near-death experience after the lightning. And everyone he touched, he would have a flash and see every memory of their whole life. The physics is the superconductor quality of the helix, a stairway of this dodeca, which is a carbon nanotube. So that's a little background. Now for the chemistry class, you need to be aware that monoatomic gold has many similar qualities. In fact, when monoatomic gold was first discovered by David Hudson, the chemistry labs all said it was silicon. And only the Russians knew how to make the flame hot enough in the spectrum analyzer to analyze the flame to prove it was gold, actually. And the same thing is true with the monoatomics for Keshe. They're misidentified. And in fact, the very concept of a monatomic is very difficult for modern chemists because it has such unusual properties. For unusual properties, visualize the unobtainium floating in the movie Avatar. I'm talking about gravity-making qualities. So let's look briefly at the unusual electrical qualities of monoatomics as it would then apply to what Dr. Keshe is doing. It turns out that the electric field around monoatomic materials, gold primarily, but this would apply to some extent to copper and carbon, is the subject, for example, of a whole book from Lawrence Gardner called The Sacred Arc, in which he, along with David Hudson, are analyzing the electric field qualities of monoatomic. The first thing he noticed is that the Hebrew word for heaven, plains of Sharon, was the name the Israelis used for the electric field around monoatomic gold. So, why is the concept of heaven, literally the spiritual idea of immortality, directly linked to the electric field created by monoatomics? This was an obvious connection in the ancient Jewish tradition. What's the physics? And Lawrence Gardner got a few things correct. He realized that the physics is correct, that immortality for the cold plasma field that is your aura does depend on that kind of electric field. Hey Ave, where the breath of charge, Hey Ave, takes flight. Plains of Sharon, or illusion fields, or when you drive in Paris on the main road, it's called the Champs-Élysées. And you know what that means? The electric field of the illusion field, the Champs, the electric field, Élysée of the illusion. It's literally a fractal field, a conjugate field. An electric field within which charge distribution is perfected. Fractalfield.com is the website for that reason.
Okay.
So now we need to talk to the chemists to help them understand why that is so. Why would the electric field around monoatomics be so perfectly distributed? The name for that distribution of charge is called scion or eon, from which we have the word science. The original word for science simply means perfect branching, and the original word for religion, the divine, simply means that which is perfectly branched, from which we get our word eon, John, St. John's Day, and perfect spark. It all refers to the same physics of perfect distribution of charge. That's what the physics is. So what is it about monoatomics that makes that work? And here's my answer. We use the word phase conjugate, which means that if you visualize a caduceus, and most of you can visualize a caduceus, we can dig up the pictures, but they're all over the website. The caduceus in physics is called phase conjugation because it's the way golden mean ratio adds and multiplies recursively constructively. And if you revolve that in 3D, and we'll add the pictures later, they're all over the website. But if you revolve that in 3D, you have our animations of the physics of what it means when you say Holy Grail. It's literally a cup within a cup. It's the Grail cup. But that simple path for charge to center, the easiest way to visualize it is we call it pine cones kissing noses. Which means perfect vortex meeting to talk well. Now, in the physics literature, this was first discovered in phase conjugate optics, where if you get lasers to meet precisely in opposing directions, literally in a cube, the name of that is called four-wave mixing. It's the first time that negentropy, self-organization, and time reversal was proven in physics, phase conjugate optics. Four-wave mixing, lasers making a cube, basically, or a square. Now, and the number of axis symmetry, that is seven arrows, that whole 7 arrows of the tetra and the heart muscle, that story. Now, if you take that arrangement of lasers meeting perfectly, or vortex meeting perfectly, and you then rotate that where the cube embeds at 32 degrees into the dodeca, the chin angle of the sphinx, as it were, Then suddenly, the 4 or 6 vortex making a cubic structure, pine cones, kissing noses, becomes dodeca, which is 12 faces, 12 pine cones, 6th pair.
Yeah.
And that geometry, Ezekiel's wheel, City of Revelation, whole of that story, that is actually how phase conjugation comes to a climax. That's the reason rainbows exist, that's the reason perception exists, that's the reason gravity exists, and that is my new book, fractalfield.com. Please read it. The frequency signature is proof that that is the only fractality in time and space. It's quite clear. And that's the picture on the cover. That frequency equation is on the cover. Planck length and time, exact exponents, which is the universal wavelength of every wave in space and time that physics has ever measured, is the fundamental key signature. You take that by Mobile's golden ratio, which we've proven is phase conjugate, you get radii and phase wavelength of hydrogen, you get the only 2 frequencies that make photosynthesis happen, you get the harmonic frequency key signature of the Schumann harmonic series, phase conjugate negentropic pump wave, and you get the frequency harmonics of the human brain waves that make bliss and peak perception, and you get the only 2 frequencies, I said photosynthesis, but you get the exact duration of the Earth year and Venus year, all implosive negentropic fractal.
Of the
Earth year and Venus year.
and Venus.
Yeah, exactly, which is where Osiris is coming back, by the way, but that's another story. The pent recursive fractal rose orbit of Venus, which is getting brighter. Have your astronomer explain why. So getting back to monoatomics, what happens is when the atom is stable in a monoatom state, just like water when it's in a clathrate dodeca, which is how they make microhydrogen, the distance to center then becomes exponents of golden ratio called phase conjugate, and non-destructive charge collapse is made possible through center. Physics of superconductivity, and when the charge implosively collapses through center, the charge radiance is set up like a perfect rose. So the aura unpacks. Now the advanced physics of this is that if you then rotate a phase conjugator, you make gravity. But to understand that, you need Tom Bearden, and I think Dr. Keshe should read Tom Bearden. That's my suggestion to him, actually, about why rotating a phase conjugator produces gravity, because then he would understand if you take, well, what he's doing beautifully, intuitively, you put these monatomic layers inside the rotating reactors, Keshe's reactions, beautifully, which we now know is what they called in the Bible the monomachine, and we know exactly electrically why that had to be in the Ark of the Covenant, which also would help Dr. Keshe. It would be in a correct kind of capacitor. But when you rotate these monoatomics, which are phase conjugators, you produce propulsion. And Dr. Keshe beautifully, because he's a bit clairvoyant, understands that when you get these 4 octahedrally arranged rotating reactors, which we saw it make gravity, but he's clairvoyant enough to see that he has to balance the symmetry of the rotators exactly, which is exactly what you do, make 4-wave mixing in phase conjugate optics, because the 4 waves have to mix perfectly to converge at center implosively. And that centripetal field is bioactive, it creates matter out of light, it creates propulsion, it creates healing, because your aura needs that in order to become centripetal and therefore self-organizing. So it's a healing field, it's a rejuvenation field, and we'll relate that later to the Priori device and our imploder spa work. But
Okay.
short break. Or did you have a question you wanted?
Well, there are multiple questions that come up, of course, but I just wondered how it relates to, you know, how he works with ALS and MS, and so he talks about the structure of carbon as seen in the MRI scan. It goes from diamond to a graphite structure.
Oh, yes, and the monoatomic carbon layering is known for the unusual electrical properties. And monoatomic helix, the carbon nanotubes, are precisely a stairway of this, so, which is dodecaecosa. And in both cases, in the monoatomic state is precisely when gravity can migrate from its natural tetracubic structure to the more unpacked charge distribution permissive ecosa-dodeca structure.
Right. And then it goes from a sort of conductive to a resistant function in terms of the electrical transmission
but
of the...
what Dr. Keshe should do now is understand the value of high dielectrics. Because yes, the carbon in the cubic structure is the conductor, but carbon in the ecosa-dodeca structure is not the conductor, but it's what's called the perfect insulator. And the perfect insulator is, for example, why houses made of living material allow your aura to grow.
Yeah.
It's called high dielectric. So if you learn how to work, I suggest that those people working there learn how to measure the dielectric constant. And let me say why that's important. If you put a dielectric constant is the quality of the insulator between the plates of a capacitor, barium strata to titanate, the famous phase conjugate, or monoatomic carbon. If the dielectric constant is high enough, it means that when you ring the capacitor like a bell with voltage, if it rings with more energy than the hammer you hit it with, it means you're getting power from gravity.
Right.
And in fact, that means that if the dielectric constant is high enough, you have a 0-point energy vacuum coherent. You've gotten free energy. Right. So dielectric constant is the absolute key to the free energy from the vacuum. It's why pine cones get voltage from gravity. So if you measure high dielectric constant, which is a perfect form of resistance, which means the bell is ringing perfect, which means it's imploding the vacuum.
Okay.
Check on the pizza.
Okay.
Okay, so we were missing a prop for the first part of our conversation about my favorite friend, Buckminster Fuller, who showed me this personally. This is called the jitterbug, and it's an interesting introduction to the idea of implosive collapse. The thing to know about the jitterbug, first of all, this is called a cube octahedron, which is the same thing as a stellated tetra. But the interesting thing is it illustrates that when the bond angles are flexible, it can go from a purely cubic tetracubic 7-arrow symmetry spin axes with one simple flex to a perfect opposite, the Ikosa pent symmetry. So this is hex and this is pent. And this jitterbug, actually, first of all, you can continue the process where you go cube octa, Ikosa. This is actually dodeca, it's hard to see it. And this is octa. So this is the complete jitterbug. But further then, from the octa symmetry, which would be the diamond carbon lattice, a simple rotation, I'm holding the two opposing triangles, flat plane parallel and perpendicular, I have the tetra. So suddenly within one structure I have tetra, octa, cube, Ikosa, dodeca. Wow. Now the physics of that, aside from metaphor, it's always talked about the Christed one, because if you arrange 13 spheres, 12 around one, the 13th one, they first assume the cube octa array, but the 13th sphere, when you take out the 13th one and then Christ merges with the other 12, you have the collapse condition. And Nassim has recently usefully showed that the trajectory path that you generate during this particular collapse, this is the cubic four-wave mixing, and now this is the pent symmetry, this is Ikosa, that trajectory there is a golden spiral, actually, which is to say implosive, conjugate, and fractal. And further, this is non-destructive collapse. This is what you did when suddenly the carbon atom was here, and it was a conductor, but it wasn't a good dielectric, and now suddenly it went here, and now it's a high dielectric, not a conductor.
Yeah.
At this point, it's implosive, conjugate. And when the charge can, the reason this is used to teach the physics of where superconductivity comes from is that when the collapse path through center presents zero resistance to that collapse, suddenly this is the physics of why gold and carbon and DNA monofilaments become superconductors when they get high amperage at the moment of crystallization, because they have formed this geometry and not this one. And this is what's happening with monoatomics. The path for charge through center is now conjugate and implosive and fractal, and it means the charge that's going through the center can radiate through golden ratio modules of the speed of light, making a rose structure called heaven, or planes of Sharon, or perfected charge distribution. And the electric field around these conjugate rotating reactors of Keshe and others is huge. And the reason the charge field is huge is because perfect compression always precedes perfect distribution. So you set up the geometry of charge collapse to be perfect, and then the charge that has gone through center is phase conjugated. And what that does in physics is eliminates everything that's out of phase. Everything not in symmetry. This is why originally when they discovered this optics, they thought they had the world by the tail, because it was the first time they proved negentropy. It's called self-organization. What is life? Life is the self-organization that results from phase conjugate negentropy. And that's why these plasma fields are actually profoundly bioactive fields. And this brings up the question of what is a bioactive field in general, our Purify.com technology and our TheImploder.com technology. But the original bioactive field was called the Shem in the Bible. And we've told this story 100 times. The word Shem originally meant the altar in the church. I will make a Shem unto the Lord. But the later Sitchin said, no, it's a high word firestone. It means it's implosive capacitor. So the reason it's the altar in the church is because it's a time-reversing, age-reversing electric field. Example, the Ark of the Covenant, which also has the quality of reducing radioactivity measurably, as the Ark of the Covenant did, and as focused human attention does, because that anything that's implosive and centripetal electrically is the opposite of radioactivity and the very essence of life. And that's why Cashier's cup of life works, rotating plasma field, and all these things. So the pure principle of what is a bioactive field is also the pure principle of implosion. It's what the Shem, what the pyramids were. They were not just power generators, but they were age reversers. Remember, the Anunnaki, they aged catastrophically when they arrived here. So if they didn't build a time-reversing field, a rejuvenation field, they were toast. You know, it's Harkonnen in the Suspensors in Dune, the same story. So if you can build a bioactive field, you actually know the essence of what Hermes was about. And conjugate cold plasma, they're called cold plasma because it's a cloud of charge that doesn't require heat to maintain the cloud, because the cloud is maintained by the fractality, the conjugation. And when you arrange them in an array structure to make propulsion, you can precipitate matter out of light. For example, it's called the manna in the desert in the Bible because when the atmospheric electrical conditions were correct, the actual monoatomics would become stable on the rocks, and you could eat it.
So how do you think where did that manna come from then in the Bible? Like,
Well, we have something called hydrocil we're using today, where it's you take a caustic alkaline, the same way they make monoatomic gold from seawater, Barry Carter's work, subtleenergy.com. The hydrocil takes rocks that are high in Ormes-related, Ormes emulet materials, and the high alkaline will dissolve, and you have this Ormes, which is again a monoatomic made liquid, and that we have this profound healing. Magicofhermes.com, you can check it out.
Magicofhermes.com.
Yeah.
And so these Ormes, orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements, they are the same thing as the Gans materials of Mr. Kish?
The cloud of charge, which is cold, in other words, why is it cold? Which is common to both of them. The reason it's cold is illustrated by Victor Schauberger. He built a vortex with water, and it was super pure water, and then it was piezoelectrically doped, so now it's capacitor. And the moment that vortex of water spontaneously began getting colder, that's when he knew he had built an electric generator that got electric power from the vacuum, from the 0 point. And it worked so well, Hitler gave him a check, actually. And we now know the physics, which was that the electrical pressure of the outer radius was different than the electric pressure of the compressional cone. It was asymmetric, egg-shaped. And that pressure difference in the piezoelectric vortex is called voltage. And that ability to track voltage from gravity is why pine cones do the same thing. And the very nature of life force, it's all about implosion.
So has anybody actually built a practical application of that?
Well, there's hundreds of practical applications, but few people can teach the physics. But the applications are abounding all around us, from Rossi and Deucalion to the cold fusion people. Now we have the nuclear battery, the Brown work. We have the implosive permanent electret battery, conjugate1.com, our Brazilian group. There's hundreds of these technologies, and we're moderating half a dozen of them ourselves.
And so, I mean, are these all just coming out of the woodwork at the moment, or have they been created for a while and then been suppressed by the powers that be? Is that?
I mean, there's a lot of ways to look at it philosophically. Certainly, a lot of inventors have been killed. There's no question. But on the other hand, take the example of the Priory device here in France. The Priory device was a cold plasma field to cones, and the frequency signature now we know fits my equation. And in the center, they had thousands of cases of cancer healed, documented by the French government. Thousands of people involved. It was very famous. But since no one could teach the physics, it fell apart. The whole movement fell apart because, in fact, it was a mystery.
And how long ago was that?
This is, I don't know, 50 years or something.
50 years ago?
Yeah, 30, 50 years ago.
But now that you're able to actually teach the physics...
That's right. We believe, and we have a working Priory device. And instantly, Elizabeth Rauscher's FDA studies, when she eliminated pain with magnetics, it turns out the frequency signature she used is the cover of my book, actually. And she agreed that I then had invented the word phase conjugate magnetics, because whether it's dielectrics, magnetics, or optics, the wave mechanics is the same. Implosive, negentropic, centripetal, and fractal conjugate. And
so this Priory device, it's actually surfacing again now?
Our prototype confidentially is in another country, and we're keeping that confidential, but the Priory device has already healed some cancer and infections. And we have 2 or 3 clinics already that are quite excited. They're people who knew about pre-read. And now that they see the physics is teachable, it is shareable. It's the old story. Until you can teach the pure principle, you can't share it, properly share technology in an empowering way.
So just take us through how one would use the pre-read device to actually heal, for example, a cancer.
You've got these 2 plasma tubes, hand-blown quartz glass tubes, and we'll show you some pictures. We'll do it when you patch them in here. But and the space between them is adjustable.
Yeah.
Now the plasma has to be fired. In this case, radio frequency range, but at precise frequency to be conjugate to Planck. And then there's a low frequency harmonic series, which is what my equation predicted, actually. And it's how we knew what pre-read was onto, because suddenly we knew why the frequency chose worked, because they're in fact a phase conjugate pump wave. So now you've got this plasma on fire in 2 jars. In the space between the jar, you feel this cold flame. A flame that does not consume, cold plasma. And in that very centripetal, the word for it in science would be broad spectral phase conjugate. Phase conjugate all the way from optics to radio down to subatomics.
So that space in the centre, that would relate to what Mr. Kesh refers to as free plasma. Is that
I think that would be a useful metaphor. It's the most centripetal and therefore the most bioactive and therefore the most rejuvenating. And note, we're calling it the rejuvenation device, but remember that time reversal has limits in physics. You can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but not the reverse. This says a lot about what you can time reverse in your own body. You can only go back to greater order.
To greater order.
You cannot return to less order, only greater order. That's
So-
the nature of rejuvenation.
So what are you referring to there?
Well, it has to do with using this field as a stem cell switch. It has to do with using this field as a radioactive source. It has to do with using this field as remote plasma containment, the holy grail of fusion energy in general.
Yeah.
It's the Foo Fighter, it's the Nazi Bell, it's the physics of, it's MagGrav, it's why it's, the same thing that is the most huge threat to national security is also the physics of how mind works. Hello.
Good morning. Yeah.
So when, the classic example is Ingo Swann. He's sitting there and he's heating a thermistor with his mind at a distance. It's the way the Bonpo and the Hopi know they're a shaman. If you can't build a flame with your mind, you ain't there yet.
No.
And so when Ingo Swann did it, then they put a Faraday cage around the thermistor, and suddenly now he's heating that thermistor at a distance through a Faraday cage, meaning no conventional electromagnetic transfers. However, a longitudinal wave, sometimes improperly called scalar or torsional, which is compressional, it goes like this instead of like this. A longitudinal EMF can contain a flame at a distance, and that's the physics of psychokinesis. And we know the frequency signature that makes it happen in the brain, how the Bonpo and the Cherokee make a flame with their mind. You get the power spectrum of the EEG right-left hemisphere golden ratio harmonic cascade, same as the Schumann harmonics, the same phase conjugate pump wave exactly down to Planck spacing. It's perfectly in tune. Then right-left hemisphere 180 degrees out of phase, and suddenly you're making longitudinals. That's psychokinetic physics.
And
that's what's behind ritual.
Is that a teachable thing, do you think?
My list tuner taught the correct frequency signatures for years, but at that point we didn't understand about the right and left hemisphere being 180 degrees out of phase, although now it's obvious. And we have advanced software now. We started with the world's most powerful binaural beat audio called Secret Sound. Download the software, adjustable, at fractalfield.com/negentropic fields. And then you convert that into frequencies which are Prairie or Rauscher. And then you convert that into capacitance and you make healing water and other things.
Nice.
So it's all about phase conjugate pump wave. If you don't know what a phase conjugate pump wave, you don't know what any negentropy is, and you don't know where mind comes from, and you don't know why an object falls to the ground.
Right. Okay, so that's the Prairie device, and there is one other device that you have developed or
Right.
associated with.
Right, we're launching
development.
2 world-shaking, we believe there'll be real breakthrough technology for pure biological rejuvenation, healing just about, this is a ridiculous thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, healing just about every disease you can throw at it, amazingly. And we have 2 such technologies launching simultaneously. One is a Prairie device we just talked about. The second is imploderspa.com. And you'll see the pictures. Imploder Spa takes the imploder.com technology, which is perfect implosive Schauberger vortex cone,
Yeah.
and input that to extreme centripetal magnetics, the most powerful on the planet. And we produce a solubility effect which is off the charts. hydration is the solution to most disease, that's old news.
Yeah.
And to produce hydrations. But now you recirculate that in this super fancy, expensive stainless tank, and you add nanobubble monohydrogen, and you add a monoatomic coating to the vortex nozzle in the imploder, and you add the trace mineral piezo Himalayan salt. And this is what the Belgian group is doing.
Trace mineral what? Himalayan salt. Ah.
And then you have a water. It's it's foamy. And this water is the most soluble hydration you've ever, it's the holy grail of water, truly. And you get in the spa with this and you drink a little bit of this and they're healing, again, every disease they've thrown at it. And I have the measurements, they will be up on the website in days, imploderspa.com.
I'll keep an eye on that, and I might actually take one back to Australia as well. How's that? How would that be?
The imploder is available shortly, and the imploder spas are coming off the line now. Great.
Okay, that's
Super.
Lovely.
Let's work together on this.
Okay, thank you very much.
Blessings.
That's really great.
More to come.
Okay.
So in a simple geometric solution here, I'm going to prove to you that infinities and finite system are absolutely related. Actually, one cannot exist without the other. And so we'll make a boundary. We'll call it a finite boundary. This is a circle. And it encloses a certain volume, right? It could be a sphere in the space. So don't reduce it necessarily to a circle. And then inside it, we're going to put an equilateral triangle. Now that triangle in a sphere could be a tetrahedron. Everybody knows what a tetrahedron is? It's one of these, right? And we can polarize that tetrahedron because the universe has spin. Things spins in the universe, and when they spin, there's polarity. So it's okay, you can polarize it. So you can polarize the triangle. And interestingly, right away, you got an ancient symbol that you can find in many, many different cultures all around the world, although it's best known by the Jewish culture as the Star of David or the Star of Zion. Well, if you look carefully, you find that as soon as I polarized the first tetrahedron, I created new boundaries that have the exact same geometry that I started with. Except these boundaries are one step smaller, right? They're one gradient or one iteration smaller. Well, what's important to remember here that each of these boundaries define a very specific center, right? Like this boundary here this is its center and this is its center, and all of the centers are all different from all other centers. That means that each of the boundary, although they are part of a similar geometry that is interactive with each other, meaning one cannot exist without the other ones, they all have their own very specific coordinates in space-time, and they observe the rest of the fractal structure from its own very specific point of view that no other boundary in the system has. You all following this? It's an important point. Now, you can polarize those, and you'll get smaller boundaries again. And again, each one is a very individual boundary. And you polarize those, you get smaller ones, and you can go to infinity doing that. So if I had this program running on my computer, it could keep zooming in and making more boundary and zooming in and making more boundaries, and it would go to infinity. Like, as long as the computer was running, it would keep going. However, I would never, ever, ever, ever escape or exceed the first boundary I've made for myself. So within the context of a finite space, I've embedded infinite amount of information, infinite amount of divisions. That means that if this is true, and if it's geometrically true, and if it's mathematically true, then it most likely is true. You could take the boundary of any of your atoms or the boundary of your cells and divide them and divide them and divide it to infinity, meaning that you have an infinite amount of information, an infinite amount of divisions within yourself. So all of a sudden, you're starting to have a mechanical and mathematical understanding of the infinite nature of your existence. It's no longer just a metaphysical concept. It's no longer a belief or a dogma. It's actually a mathematical equation. Does that make sense to you? So this is crucial, because without it, you're still in dogma. And so, what does it mean to physics? I mean, it means a lot to spirituality and philosophy. But what it means to physics is that if physicists understood that, this simple example, they would stop building accelerators. We keep thinking that we're going to find the smallest particle. So maybe instead of looking for a fundamental particle, a God particle, we should start looking for a fundamental pattern of division. Because if we understood the pattern, then we would understand how the universe creates. We would have the key to the divisions of the space that produce our reality. We would have the key to creation. That could be fairly useful. So this was a private conference, and you know, I went there with this book called Gravitation. Gravitation is like the Bible of relativistic equation, Einstein field equations, and it's written by, you know, giants of physics, Wheeler, Thorne, and Meissner. You know, it's thought to be the Bible of relativistic physics, and you know, it's called Gravitation because you can see it's quite thick, so when you pick it up, you know everything you need to know about gravity. And I was at this conference and I kept on asking annoying question. Why annoying? Because in advanced physics conference, usually you don't ask question that has to do with fundamental physics. Everybody there is supposed to have accepted fundamental physics, learned them a long time ago. They don't want to revisit it. You're supposed to be in, like, you know, 11-fold geometry of Calabi-Yau space, string theory, all this stuff is happening, really complex equation, and I kept on asking basic questions. For example, I was getting there. Gee. At one point, I pulled out my gravitation and I opened it on page 719, and I said, so if I understand well from all the equations that we've been studying, the universe model that we have today resembles a balloon, and this is actually the example they give you in physics text. And it's a balloon that's expanding that has pennies glued to it. And the pennies are representing galaxies. And as the balloon expands, the galaxies move away from each other. And everybody's like, yes, Nassim, that's correct. And I said, well, the part I'm missing, I'm sure I missed it. I'm sure, you know, you guys can point me out to it and I'll just shut up from there on. But like, what I really want to know, and I haven't found it, I've been studying a lot, you know, and so what I really want to know is where the equation that explains who's this guy.
you.